Throughout history, war has often been characterized as being an elaborate game of chess, played by the generals commanding their armies on the chessboard that is the battlefield. This characterization has led to the perception of many of history's great duels being between two key opposing players. And in 1942, on the deserts of North Africa, a land described as being ideal for the game of war, there seemed no greater player than the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommell. Commanding the German Afrika Korps, it seemed like the man who history remembers as the Desert Fox could not be stopped. The British Empire forces who opposed him changed leaders several times until one man stood up to the plate who could match him both in genius and in charisma. This man's name was General Bernard Montgomery, who would become remembered in history simply as Monty. But Monty's story extends beyond this one battlefield, and in this episode, we are going to explore more of the man who heralded the turning point in the fight against Nazi tyranny. Welcome to Wars of the World. The story of Monty began on November 17th, 1887, in Kennington, Surrey. Born Bernard Law Montgomery, he was the fourth child of 9 belonging to one Henry Montgomery, a Church of Ireland minister, and his wife, Maud. Despite being in the upper classes of the day, the family struggled with debts, particularly concerning their Irish estate of New Park in County Donegal, in the province of Ulster. When Bernard was just 2, the family moved to the island of Tasmania on the southern coast of Australia, where Henry took up the post as bishop there. This required Henry to travel from the family home for extended periods, leaving Bernard and his siblings in the care of his mother, who was known to be violent and at times neglectful of her children, something the young Bernard would never forget or forgive her for. By the start of the new century, the family had moved on to England, where Bernard completed his education before deciding on a military career, being accepted into the prestigious Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. However, that career was almost cut short, as his experiences living a colonial life in Tasmania had left him a rather raucous and overconfident and self-assured young lad, and he found himself facing expulsion for fighting with his classmates. He managed to avoid this fate, however, and graduated in September 1908, joining the 1st Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment as a 2nd lieutenant. By the outbreak of the Great War in the summer of 1914, Montgomery had earned a promotion, but the lieutenant was almost left out of the war when, during the Battle of Ypres in November 1914, he was shot by a German sniper, the bullet tearing through his lung. His wound was so severe that a grave was dug for him. However, the tough young officer recovered and returned to service, before being shot again, but this time through the knee, and he refused to bow out of the war. Montgomery was decorated for his gallantry, and was mentioned in dispatches numerous times, leading to promotion yet again. Captain Montgomery returned to the Western Front in 1916, after recuperating in Britain from his earlier wounds, and served as a General Staff Officer, participating in several notable battles, such as the Battle of Arras in spring 1917, and later that same year in the Battle of Passchendaele. By the war's end, he had become Chief of Staff of the 47th, the 2nd London Division. Working so closely with some of the most senior officers in the British Army during the Great War had left a profound impact on Montgomery, but rather than be inspired, he was at times disgusted by the way they treated those under their command. As he later recalled in life, quote, "The higher staffs were out of touch with the regimental officers and with the troops. The former lived in comfort, which became greater as the distance of their headquarters behind the lines increased. My war experiences led me to believe that the staff must be the servant of the troops, and that a good staff officer must serve his commander and the troops, but himself be anonymous. The frightful casualties appalled me. The so-called good fighting generals of the war appeared to me to be those who had a complete disregard for human life. There were of course exceptions, and I suppose one such was Plummer. I had only once seen him and had never spoken to him." End quote. These experiences would greatly shape Montgomery's own conduct later in his career. In the meantime, peace was short-lived for the already celebrated staff officer. In the immediate post-war period, he served in the British Army of the Rhine, Britain's occupational force stationed in the region after the war. To advance his career, he applied for a place at the British Army Staff College, but was rejected. However, that wasn't going to stop him, and during a game of tennis, he quietly approached Field Marshal Sir William Robertson, the commander of the British Occupational Force, and persuaded him to add his name. After completing this course, he found himself in his ancestral home of Ireland. While the Easter Rebellion of 1916 had been quashed, the desire for Irish independence had only grown, and now the British Army was engaged in anti-guerrilla operations against the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. Montgomery found himself serving in the capacity of a brigade major in the 17th Infantry Brigade when he arrived in Ireland in January 1921. Based in County Cork, the general feeling amongst officers such as himself was that this conflict was already lost from their perspective, unless they were allowed to take a much tougher stance against the rebels. Montgomery later lamented that Oliver Cromwell, or the Germans for that matter, would have settled the conflict in a very short period of time, but British public opinion was divided at best, limiting their actions. Montgomery himself would find his own conduct questionable by members of the British government when he retreated from what he saw as a hopeless situation in the town of Macroom, whilst looking for 4 missing British Army officers who, unbeknown to him, had already been murdered by the IRA. The IRA had set an ambush which Montgomery reasoned was impossible to escape without sustaining very heavy losses among his own men, and so he withdrew before shots were fired, giving the IRA a clear victory while apparently damaging British prestige, although later Montgomery was praised for his sound judgment. In the end, Montgomery agreed that while he was confident the British Army could defeat the Irish Rebellion, the sentiment behind it could not wholly be stamped out, and that withdrawal, save for the region of Ulster in the north, was the correct course of action. He and the rest of his comrades left Southern Ireland behind, which predictably descended into its own brief but bloody civil war. Returning to Britain in May 1923, the 35-year-old undertook several staff positions, during which he began to take an interest in the theory of armoured warfare. He also took the opportunity to focus on starting a family, eventually marrying the widower Elizabeth Carver, the sister of another famous British World War II general, Sir Percy Hobart. Elizabeth, who Montgomery referred to affectionately as Betty, had 2 children from her previous marriage, which she took on. And additionally, the marriage was blessed with another child in 1923, a son named David. Sadly, just 9 years later, Betty would die from an infected insect bite sustained while on holiday, something which almost broke Montgomery, who in order to cope with his grief, threw himself into his work. Unbeknownst to him, he was about to get very busy indeed. When war broke out in September 1939, the world was still in the era of the old empires, and none were more prosperous or far-reaching as the British Empire, which included swathes of territory in Africa and Asia, territory which new would-be emperors eyed lecherously. One such wannabe emperor was Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who was bent on building a new Roman Empire. With Britain seemingly on the verge of defeat at the hands of his Nazi German ally, he struck out from the Italian colony of Libya into British Egypt. However, in one of the most lopsided battles in history, despite the Italians outnumbering the British Commonwealth forces stationed there, sometimes as much as 10-1, the Italian invaders were almost routed. Soon the British troops were pursuing Mussolini's troops across Libya, forcing the Italian dictator to turn to Adolf Hitler for help, having already rejected the Führer's initial offer prior to the opening of Mussolini's doomed campaign. Hitler had little real interest in North Africa, as he was already focusing on his campaign against the Soviet Union. He did recognize that it could potentially be of use in strangling British supply lines by cutting off the Suez Canal, and even opening a land route to the southern Caucasus region of the Soviet Union through the Middle East, which of course was also rich in oil reserves. Hitler therefore authorized the formation of the Afrika Korps, which could be sent to aid the Italians. For the German military leadership, this assignment was not viewed as being particularly prestigious, since it was primarily seen as a blocking action against the loss of further Italian territory. However, it did offer them the chance to get rid of one of their number who had begun to be seen as something of a disruptive element with his often radical ideas, this being Field Marshal Erwin Rommell. When Rommel took command of the Afrika Korps, it was a ragtag force which was under-supported by Hitler for the task at hand. However, Rommel's genius was being able to take this small force and utilize it to its fullest. Rather than simply blocking the British Commonwealth forces, he actually reversed the situation and began pursuing them back into Egypt, despite requests from Berlin to slow his progress. Rommel was elevated to near legendary status and would forever afterwards become known as the Desert Fox, in reference to his cunning. British forces soon began to fear Rommel as he developed an air of invincibility about him after several assassination attempts had failed. It would not be until the First Battle of Al Alamein that he would finally be brought to a halt, but it was a close-run thing, and everyone knew that a second battle would soon follow. If the British forces were then defeated, then the Desert Fox would have a clear run to the Suez Canal. Having lost confidence in General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the most senior officer leading the fight, Prime Minister Winston Churchill relieved him and replaced them with the boisterous and aggressive Lieutenant General William Gott. However, before he could take up his new role, the plane carrying him to Africa was intercepted and shot down, killing Gott in the process. Therefore, the job was passed to now General Bernard Montgomery. Historians have debated who would have been the most competent commander between Gott and Montgomery. But what can't be denied is that Montgomery brought something with him that probably wouldn't be fully appreciated until later. A character with which to counter the reputation Rommel had established. Indeed, one of the first tasks which Monty, as he became known to his troops, had set himself was to dispel the myth that Rommel was invincible, reminding them that the Desert Fox could be stopped, and it was now up to them to capitalize on their success. From the moment he took command on August 13th, 1942, the 8th Army, known as the Desert Rats, found itself the subject of a whirlwind of activity as Monty reorganized it, separating the mixed armored and infantry units into individual corps so they could focus on their own goals as he dictated them. Remembering how out of touch the generals were on the Western Front, he moved his headquarters closer to the fighting and went to great lengths to increase cooperation with the RAF and the Royal Navy. Demonstrating his all-or-nothing attitude, he began reinforcing the El Alamein line with units which had initially been held back for the defense of Cairo. On a personal level, he dropped the standard British Army officer's cap and replaced it with the distinctive black beret of the Armoured Corps, upon which were the badges of the Royal Tank Regiments, who would be key to the victory in the upcoming days, along with the British General Officer's badge. And this, along with his high-energy speeches and confident, sometimes eccentric personality, completed the character of Monty to his men. Observers noted that within a week of him taking command, the atmosphere within the Desert Rats had been completely transformed, and with it came a new confidence. Monty also had to contend with an impatient Churchill, who demanded he launch a counteroffensive immediately. But Monty stood fast, refusing to act until his meticulous planning was completed. Finally, on October 23, 1942, he was ready. Under his command were 190,000 men from across the British Empire, Greece, Poland and France, and they were equipped with over 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, and 1,400 anti-tank guns. Monty's preparations proved decisive, and he struck out against Rommel's lines, breaking them and forcing the Desert Fox into retreat. Monty's tactics were calculated and logical, wearing down Rommel's troops by applying persistent pressure, taking advantage of the German and Italians' weakened and overstretched supply lines. Rommel was forced into a fighting retreat westward as his fuel and ammunition stores were exhausted, but he would find no solace anywhere as on November 8th, Allied forces began landing in Algeria and Morocco, boxing in the Desert Fox and driving him to ultimate defeat. Monty's victory reinvigorated the British war effort, which had seen numerous setbacks throughout 1941 and 42, and is credited as the turning point in the whole war against Nazi Germany. Monty was immediately elevated to the status of a national hero, but the war was far from over. In the months that followed, Rommel continued to put up a valiant effort, but by 1943, the North Africa campaign had been decided, and Hitler thus lost interest in supporting it, focusing on his war in the east against Stalin. For his role in North Africa, Monty was additionally awarded the Legion of Merit by his US allies, whom he was now having to work with more closely. Monty would frequently clash over plans with his American partners, particularly concerning the next phase of the war, which saw the Allies land in Sicily and then the Italian mainland, attacking what Churchill viewed as Europe's soft underbelly. Despite Mussolini being overthrown and an armistice agreed with the legitimate Italian government, German troops and pro-fascist Italian forces ground down the Allied advance northwards. Monty would later blame a number of factors for this, such as a lack of coordination and aggression on the part of some of those in command positions, describing the whole affair as a dog's breakfast. As the Allied troops were still clawing their way up the Italian peninsula, Monty was assigned his next role to help plan and command the ground elements of the Normandy landings, where he would be facing Rommel once again. D-Day was to be one of the biggest challenges any of the Allied commanders had faced thus far. Given his wealth of experience and the esteem he was held in by the British public for his success at El Alamein, it was expected that he would be appointed in the role of the Supreme Allied Commander for D-Day. However, that role ultimately fell to US General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Even Churchill agreed with this posting, as Eisenhower was far more suited to dealing with the big personalities and egos of men like Montgomery, Patton, and Bradley, who at times were described as behaving like squabbling children when they dealt with one another. Montgomery was placed in command of the 21st Army Group, and he envisioned a 90-day battle with British and Canadian troops, holding a line against the expected German counterattack, allowing the US forces to break out and pivot back to attack these German troops, catching them in a classic pincer movement. After the landings finally took place on June 6, 1944, France was hit by poor weather, which greatly hindered the Allied breakout. Montgomery's plans soon had to be modified time and again as the situation unfolded, until in mid-July, British forces undertook Operation Goodwood to divert German forces so that the American troops could encircle them in the Falaise pocket, where they would be pummeled into destruction. This effort worked and opened the door for the Allies to liberate Paris and then march towards the German border. As the Germans began losing ground, the Allies knew that their momentum was about to take a serious blow when they reached the Rhine and its many tributaries. Therefore, Montgomery devised a plan which has since been described as uncharacteristically ambitious, given his previous meticulous and logical approach to command. Codenamed Market Garden, it involved the seizure of key bridges in the Netherlands by the 101st and 82nd US Airborne Divisions, and also the 1st British Airborne Division, who would land by parachute and glider. Then, the British 30 Corps would advance over the bridges and cross the Rhine's tributaries in one quick thrust. The bridges were located at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Wegel, Grave, and Arnhem, and covered a combined distance of 62 miles. If successful, the plan would liberate the Netherlands, outflank Germany's formidable frontier defences at the Siegfried Line, and make possible an armoured drive into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. However, this was a risky plan, and famously it led to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning telling Monty that he may be going a bridge too far. And that proved exactly to be the case. On September 17, 1944, airborne forces captured their objectives, but met unexpectedly heavy opposition from two SS Panzer divisions in the area. The paratroopers had few weapons which could counter the heavy German armour, while 30 Corps failed to reach the last bridge at Arnhem. As a result, the British 1st Airborne Division alone at Arnhem lost around 75% of their men, either killed or captured, and the crossing of the Rhine was delayed by 6 months as the Allied reorganised themselves into a broad front before advancing again. Market Garden stained the reputation of Montgomery, but he was able to restore some of his lost prestige when the Germans launched their famous winter counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, in what is remembered now as the Battle of the Bulge. By deploying 30 Corps quickly and releasing reserves, Montgomery was able to help halt and then repulse the German troops. After that, he returned to planning a more cautious and less ambitious advance through the Rhine, these being undertaken in March 1945. By May, Nazi Germany was in its death throes, having been beaten down with heavy bombing and then strangled into defeat by Allied armies on 3 fronts. On May 4, 1945, on Lüneburg Heath, Lower Saxony, Montgomery formally accepted the surrender of the German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. In the post-war euphoria, Monty continued to enjoy his legendary status amongst the British population, despite the disaster of Market Garden, his battle with the Desert Fox in North Africa becoming embedded in British history, alongside other great British duels such as Waterloo. Montgomery was appropriately made 1st Viscount of Alamein and appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army of the Rhine, BAOR, in Western Germany. His status continued to overshadow some of the more controversial chapters of his later life, such as voicing support for apartheid in South Africa, being impressed by the Chinese leadership following a visit to the communist power, and speaking against the legalization of homosexuality, declaring it a charter for buggery, and openly criticizing US policy and tactics in Vietnam. His personal memoir also alienated many of those he had served with, as he used the book as an opportunity to lash out against men such as Eisenhower and publicly criticize them. Montgomery died from unspecified causes in 1976 at his home in Isington Mill in Hampshire, aged 88. After a funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, his body was buried in Holy Cross Churchyard in Binstead. 3 years later, a statue of him created by sculptor Oscar Niemann was erected in Whitehall, London. His memory continues to be revered in British society, and his image is often used as a symbol of British resilience.